The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed.
Machiavelli is one of the greatest political philosophers of all time. His work, The Discorsi, would advocate for a self-governing republic and highlight that living under a monarch with absolute rule was akin to slavery, providing the political underpinnings for both the English and American revolutions. But Machiavelli's other work, The Prince, would have a far more sinister influence. A guidebook to rulers on how to gain and consolidate power. The Prince was considered so dangerous, it was banned by the Catholic Church for more than 200 years. It has not only paved the way for tyrants, despots and dictators, but has had a profound impact on business, politics, religion, and the halls of power on every continent of the globe. But what did Machiavelli say? Who did he influence? And how has what a man wrote 500 years ago shaped the modern world in which we live today? From the White House to the Kremlin, from the Vatican to the Federal Reserve, this is how a man from Florence changed the course of history. This is how the writings of Niccolo Machiavelli are used to manipulate and control everyone. In 1469, Niccolo Machiavelli was born in Florence. The son of a lawyer, he was not born into a family of great wealth, nor one of poverty, but a family that prioritized a classical education, with Machiavelli being trained in what was known at the time as Studia Humanitatis, or in English, the studies of humanity. At the age of 7, he would begin learning Latin, followed by grammar, rhetoric, and poetry, with their education considered complete when one had learnt ancient history and moral philosophy. It was commonly believed that these subjects would best prepare someone for public life. As Cicero had once said, "These disciplines nurture the values we principally need in order to serve our country well." And luckily for Machiavelli, that time would come sooner than expected. 500 years ago, Italy was not the same as it is today. It was not one unified country, but rather a collection of independent city-states, each with its own ruler and government. The Pope ruled Rome, the Medici's Florence, and the Sforza family Milan, all competing and waging war against each other for power and influence. It was in 1434 that the Medici family had established their rule over Florence, with their expertise in banking and commerce, transforming the city into an economic powerhouse. In 1469, the same year Machiavelli was born, Lorenzo de' Medici came to power, with his family renowned for being keen financiers of Florentine culture, using their immense wealth to fund artists such as Michelangelo, Botticelli and Da Vinci. But although the Medicis were great patrons of the Italian Renaissance, Lorenzo was accused of being a tyrant, whose greed, corruption and immorality defied the teachings of the Christian Church. He would later die in 1492, and just 2 years later, King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy. The Medici family, who had ruled Florence for 60 years, would now lose their grip on power, with the Florentine people supported by the French, driving them out of the city. Florence then established a great council, composed of thousands of men from the region's noble families. From these men, a small group were elected, and they, in turn, would appoint others to help run the city. The Florentine Republic was born. With many positions within the Republic needing to be filled, Machiavelli's name was put forward, with it being likely that his intelligence and drive were noticed by the Great Council. And so, in 1498, at the age of just 29, and with no prior diplomatic experience, Machiavelli was elected to Secretary of the Second Chancery, a position that had to coordinate all the correspondence and relations with regard to Florence's territorial possessions. Shortly afterwards, he was also appointed to Secretary to the Ten of War, the committee responsible for all the foreign and diplomatic relations of the Republic. In this position, Machiavelli could be called upon to travel on behalf of the Ten, negotiating with potential allies, gathering information, and aiding the Ten's ambassadors by writing up detailed reports on foreign affairs and sending them home to Florence. For the next 14 years, Machiavelli would be sent on various important missions across the European continent, where he would travel to numerous states, representing Florence's interests and getting to see for himself how power really operated behind closed doors. For his first mission, Machiavelli would visit Caterina Sforza, the Countess of Imola and Forli, before being sent for 6 months to the court of Louis XII, the King of France. He was next sent to observe Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Romagna and Captain General of the Papal Army, who, with the support of the French, would conquer large portions of northern Italy. In 1506, Machiavelli would visit the new Pope, Julius II, making extensive notes on his character and leadership, and a year later would be sent on his last mission, to the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian I. It would be these diplomatic experiences, coupled with lessons from Greek and Roman history, that would provide Machiavelli with the material needed to write The Prince, a collection of notes and lessons he had observed regarding statecraft, leadership, and manipulation. Far from the Christian ideals of modesty and temperance of the time, The Prince would delve behind the curtains and highlight the true mechanisms and tactics rulers use to gain, consolidate, and exercise power. The Prince would not be published during Machiavelli's lifetime, with it being only 5 years after his death in 1532 that the first printed copies of the book were distributed. Some would call it the work of Satan's finger, and others a handbook for tyrants, with William Shakespeare in the early 1600s using the term Machiavel to refer to a cunning and scheming person. But over time, some would begin to see the Prince in a different light, that it described the world as it really operates, with the French philosopher Rousseau believing its contents were a service to the public, exposing and allowing them to observe the secret tactics of tyrants. English philosopher Francis Bacon stated that we are much beholden to Machiavel and others that write what men do and not what they ought to do. But perhaps the Prince's impact is stated best by author Tim Parks. Machiavelli's little book was a constant threat. It reminded people that power is always up for grabs, always a question of what can be taken by force or treachery, and always, despite all protests to the contrary, the prime concern of any ruler. But for one ruler in particular, Machiavelli's words would have a profound impact, one that would not only change the course of history, but would result in the death and subjugation of tens of millions of people.
Можно мне вас поцеловать, товарищ Сталин? За все, что вы сделали для нашего народа, для нас. Один там вдруг Сталин! Виват Сталин! Виват Сталин!
Stalin! Long live Stalin!
Мира и счастья всем вам, друзья мои!
In all actions of all men, and especially of princes, where there is no court of appeal, the end justifies the means. Perhaps no man in history has taken these words more seriously than Joseph Stalin, who was known to annotate his own copy of The Prince. Ruling over the Soviet Union from 1928 until his death in 1953, Stalin would, through the calculated use of terror, force, and propaganda, transform the Soviet Union into a world power, while gaining the love, support, and admiration of his people. You must either pamper people or destroy them. Harm them just a little and they'll hit back. Harm them seriously and they won't be able to. So if you're going to do people harm, do it in such a way that you do not have to fear their vengeance. To consolidate his power, Stalin was willing to use any and all tools at his disposal to completely crush his opponents, making sure they stood no chance of challenging his rule. His political rivals would be shot, citizens who spoke out against him would be hunted down, and millions would be sentenced to backbreaking work in gulag labour camps, where they would be forced to carry out decades of slave labour on highly dangerous projects for the state. In 1937, Stalin would take these measures to the extreme, launching the Great Terror, a campaign to rid society of his rivals and anyone who displeased him. Lasting for a year and a half, the Great Terror would spread fear across the entire country, with over 1,500 people being killed each day. Husbands would turn on their wives, children on their parents, and by the time the Great Terror had come to an end, there was no one left to speak out against Stalin's rule. By the time of Stalin's death in 1953, over 26 million people had been shot, imprisoned, or subjected to internal exile, an average of over 1 million per year. But how was Stalin able to get away with so much? How could he purge, torture, and control an entire empire without any repercussions? The answer lies within one of Machiavelli's most important rules: propaganda. So long as he has the people on his side, a ruler needn't worry about conspiracies. But when they are against him and hate him, he'll have to watch everyone's every move. Stalin understood that public support was crucial to his position. If he was loved and the people swore allegiance only to him, it would be very difficult for his enemies to oust him from power. And so, Stalin would go to extreme lengths to develop a cult of personality, with the state producing an endless stream of propaganda, portraying Stalin as a hero and a god. Statues of him were erected across the country. The city of Tsaritsyn was renamed to Stalingrad, and during World War II, Stalin's name was added to the national anthem. The printing presses were also nationalised, with only officially sanctioned writers able to publish books and write plays. Thousands of posters would be produced to make him appeal to every aspect of society. To the worker, he was a common man, smoking a pipe and riding the subway with his fellow citizens. To families, he was a father figure, beloved by children who would present him with flowers and adoring smiles. And to soldiers, he was the defender of Mother Russia, a great general, wearing a military uniform and leading the Soviet armies to victory during the Second World War. The best fortress which a prince can possess is the affection of his people. Every citizen of the Soviet Union, no matter their age, would be targeted by Stalin's propaganda machine. In 1935, the phrase, "Thank you dear comrade Stalin for a happy childhood," appeared above doorways at nurseries, orphanages and schools. People's homes would also begin incorporating private Stalin rooms, a place featuring his portrait, where they could fully dedicate themselves to their beloved leader. Known by titles such as Brilliant Genius of Humanity and Gardener of Human Happiness, Stalin was known to receive standing ovations after his speeches. Most would last upwards of 15 minutes, with the secret police carefully watching the crowd and arresting the first person to stop applauding, a crime punishable by 10 years of hard labour in the Gulag. With complete control over the information his citizens received, Stalin's cult of personality would be extremely effective, with him being loved by the general population, many of whom believed the country would completely collapse without him. Stalin's death would see a massive outpouring of grief, with citizens from across the empire travelling to Moscow to pay their respect. Even prisoners in the Gulag, many of whom Stalin had sent there himself, are known to have wept at the news of his passing. With Machiavelli's book by his side, Stalin had managed to convince an entire nation of his greatness, to feel genuine love for him, all the while committing numerous atrocities against them. But it's not just those in the past that use Machiavelli's teachings, for politicians in the present are just as duplicitous. They just use a different means of control, means less obvious to the common man. Modern mass media has made the most tyrannical leaders fiercely beloved, even by the subjects they've taken advantage of. But influence and resources in the hands of a tiny few eventually leads to unrest. It cripples even the most powerful empires. If you look at the news, you can see these dynamics are even further entrenched today. Bloomberg analysts estimate that in the next 25 years, over 62% of the USA's wealth will belong to its wealthiest 1%. That number would crush the previous all-time high of 51% set in 1928, a year before the stock market crash and the Great Depression, meaning it's harder than ever to get by. Luckily, there is now a very exciting new way to maybe get ahead. We haven't gotten the chance to invest yet, but you can now join us in getting access to the same market elite members of society have had access to for decades, all thanks to today's sponsor Masterworks. By giving investors just like you the chance to potentially protect and grow their wealth with million-dollar, blue-chip, investment-grade art. They've delivered on 16 exits, all of them profitable for their investors. But it's easy to see why nearly 800,000 people have signed up so far. Masterworks offerings have sold out within hours, but our subscribers can now skip the waitlist and start collecting today. Just click the link in the description.
Perhaps I can help you, Chuck. I think the election was a victory for good government. It might also be called a victory for propaganda. But that would have been equally true if our opponent had won.
But how can you study it?
Well, you can begin by investigating the techniques of propaganda. You'll find that the purpose of most propaganda is to persuade people to believe something, to do something, or to buy something. I find it interesting, and there's plenty to study. Here I have just a few of the many books on the subject. Hitler and Nazi Germany had a campaign of propaganda that ran over many years. Then there's a wealth of propaganda to study on the subject of Russia and communism. There's propaganda to study in our own American elections, national as well as local, and in many of the major issues on which elections often hinge.
Well, if I don't learn about propaganda, it won't be because there's no way to study it.
That's right, Chuck. Remember the techniques of propaganda, and use the procedure we out is a powerful force. So powerful that your study of propaganda is important not only to you, but to me, and to the world.
In general, people judge more by appearances than first-hand experience, because everyone gets to see you, but hardly anyone deals with you directly. Everyone sees what you seem to be. Few have experience of who you really are. Modern politicians prioritize one thing above all else: their appearance. Machiavelli argues that rulers should cultivate the appearance of virtue, to present themselves as virtuous and moral, even if they do not necessarily act that way in private. A new ruler cannot always act in ways that are considered good, but it is crucial that he should nevertheless appear to be good, and especially that he should appear to be exceptionally compassionate, loyal, humane, honest, and devout. But what is the best way for a modern politician to appear virtuous? The answer is to spend, spend, and spend. Who doesn't want more money for infrastructure projects, education, healthcare, or social services? The more money a politician spends, the more they are seen as compassionate, and the higher their chances of re-election. But this hasn't always been the case. Historically, this way of appealing to the masses has always ended in disaster, and looks a little something like this. A ruler comes to power and embarks on a large amount of spending on public projects. The people are pleased and happy with the many benefits they receive from the government. Their taxes are then raised to pay for the spending. They then begin to hate the leader, and then the leader is removed from power. As Machiavelli argues, generosity is self-defeating. The more you spend, the more you will need to tax, and the more you tax, the more you will be hated. Above all, he mustn't seize other people's property. A man will sooner forget the death of his father than the loss of his inheritance. But modern politicians have found a sneaky and deceiving way around this, a way most people are completely unaware of, something called inflation tax. Have you ever wondered why things used to be so much cheaper? In 1971, a new house cost $25,000, and the average rent was only $150 per month. A movie ticket would cost $1.50, eggs 45 cents per dozen, and gasoline would set you back a whopping 40 cents per gallon at the pump. Even a Harvard education would cost you just $2,600 for a full year of tuition. So why are things so much more expensive today? The answer is simple. The government prints money as much as they like in unlimited amounts. The more they print, the less the money is worth, and as a result, the prices of goods and services goes up. But you might be asking yourself a question. How are they able to print so much money? They're able to do this because of the type of money we have, a type of money called fiat. But to understand what fiat is, we first have to understand what money is and where fiat has come from. Before money existed, humans had to barter. That is, goods and services had to be traded for other goods and services. A cow for a sheep, an apple for an orange. But this system was incredibly inefficient, and not everyone wanted what you had to trade. And so would rise a form of money, a medium of exchange, a unit of measurement, and a store of value that everyone agreed to use so they wouldn't need to barter. In ancient societies, money would first appear in the form of seashells and beads, things that were all small, similar in size, durable, and easily identifiable. Factors that are common occurrences for forms of money across different cultures and timeframes. As civilizations evolved and became more advanced, money would begin to appear in the form of precious metals, usually silver or gold, that were then melted down and formed into coins. This form of money would last for thousands of years, until, in the modern age, we have adopted paper as our form of money. However, this paper was not like the fiat money we have today. Instead, it was something called representative money, a piece of paper that represented something else of intrinsic value. Rather than have to carry around a lot of heavy metal coins, people would deposit their money into banks, who, in turn, would issue them paper banknotes, which represented the amount of precious metals they had exchanged. These banknotes, a new form of currency, would then circulate around the economy, and at any time could be redeemed for their value in silver or gold. In the 18th and 19th centuries, governments and central banks would adopt this system and apply it to their national currencies. For example, in 1934, under what was known as the gold standard, a $35 bill would be backed by 1 ounce of gold. It was important that paper money was backed by gold, as it imposed limits on government spending. They wouldn't be able to print more money without in turn increasing the amount of gold they held in reserve. As a result, prices remained stable and people were able to save without the fear of inflation eroding away their purchasing power. But not all countries and governments had precious metals backing their money, and as a result, the governments printed too much, hyperinflation ensued, and both the currency and economy collapsed. Before the Great War, Germany was a wealthy nation, with its currency backed by gold. They were a world leader in manufacturing, with unrivaled expertise in optics, chemicals, and machinery. The German mark, the British shilling, the French franc, and the Italian lira all had about equal value, with 4 units of each currency able to be exchanged for $1. However, in 1914, at the start of the First World War, Germany abandoned the gold standard and resorted to printing money in order to fund the conflict. But this policy worked to no avail, and by the end of the war in 1918, Germany was surrounded, its allies were defeated, with inflation beginning to take a toll on the population, prices having doubled since the start of the conflict. As a result, Germany was forced to surrender, and 7 months later in 1919, they signed the Treaty of Versailles, which named Germany as solely responsible for the outbreak of the war, and demanded that huge reparations be paid to the Allied forces. The Germans would refer to this agreement as the Article of Shame. But these reparations, which totaled 2 years of its pre-war GDP, would prove too costly for the German state to bear. Resources would soon begin to be stripped and taken from their country as forms of repayment, including goods produced in factories, their livestock and raw materials such as lumber, iron and coal. As these assets flowed out of the country, the state would resort to printing vast quantities of money in order to pay the workers and finance government expenditure. As the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, began to print more and more, it was hard to stop, with the government enlisting 130 companies to help churn out piles of increasingly worthless paper notes. The more they printed, the less the currency was worth, and hyperinflation soon arrived upon the doorsteps of every household in the country. Do you remember that 4 German marks in 1913 were around $1? Well, the government printed so much money that by the end of 1923, it wouldn't cost 4 or 40 or even 400 marks to purchase $1, but instead 4.2 billion. Prices for everyday items would begin to spiral out of control, with wheelbarrows needed to transport people's money to local stores. A loaf of bread that had cost 250 marks in January 1923 would cost more than 200 billion in November. Cash would be burned for fuel. Children would use paper notes as building blocks and create kites for their entertainment. Eventually, it ended up costing more to print one note than one note itself was worth, with the currency soon collapsing. The German mark would serve as a lesson of history and a warning to future economies that a currency backed by nothing will eventually be worth nothing, with the destruction and carnage financial collapse brings about, giving tyrants and despots the opportunity to seize control.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference.
After the Second World War, the United States had emerged as a financial superpower, having accumulated over 80% of the world's gold supply. And so, they would sought to position themselves as the leader of a new global monetary system, one that would promote peace and stability, that would help prevent the outbreak of another war. To negotiate this new system, 44 nations from around the globe would travel to Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, where they would all mutually agree upon a new framework by which the world's currencies were exchanged and valued. Under this new system, nations, instead of pegging their currencies to gold, as had been done under the gold standard, would instead peg their currencies to the US dollar, which, in turn, was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. The world was effectively back on the gold standard. Countries could trade their currencies for US dollars, which then could be exchanged for gold. The US dollar was now the world's reserve currency. However, fast forward 30 years and history would begin to repeat itself. Much like the Romans, the Chinese, the Spanish, the British, the Germans, and all rulers and governments that have come before, the United States fell into the same trap. They began to spend beyond their means. Overly ambitious projects like the Great Society, social programs aimed at eradicating poverty were introduced, and the Vietnam War, a geopolitical conflict aimed at stopping the spread of communism, began to soak up vast sums of government expenditure. Foreign nations, realizing the US government had printed more money to fund these ventures than they had in gold reserves, would begin to panic, and started the process of swapping their dollars for gold. With the nation's gold reserves being depleted, Richard Nixon, on August 15, 1971, would address the nation via television, and declared that he was stopping the international convertibility of US dollars into gold.
Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
With the dollar's link to gold being severed, the Bretton Woods system had come to an end, with the age of fiat currency now emerging. All the world's currencies were now backed by nothing. What would result is one of the greatest heists in history, an act of deception so big that even Machiavelli would look on with astonishment. No longer would governments around the world have to raise excess funds via taxes, something Machiavelli had warned against. Instead, they were now free to print as much money as they wished. They could now steal their population's wealth without them even realizing it, because although the amount of money in their bank account stayed the same, the value of that money went down. For example, if you had saved $1 in your bank account in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was created, that dollar would only be worth 4 cents today. In just 100 years, the dollar has lost 96% of its purchasing power. But since 1971, the United States government hasn't just printed a lot of money. They have embarked on the greatest spending spree of any nation at any point in recorded history. Let's take a look at their national debt. Since its founding in 1776, through the American Revolution, the Civil War, as well as the First and Second World Wars, by 1971, the US national debt stood around $400 billion. What had taken nearly 200 years to accumulate would now be dwarfed by comparison. Just 50 years since the dollar had left the gold standard, the national debt now stands at $31 trillion. There were no world wars, no Great Depressions, but with fiat money now under government control, they had managed to accumulate $31 trillion of debt. So, what are the costs of this? Well, the cost is inflation tax. The more money the government prints, the less the dollar is worth, and the less the dollar is worth, the more expensive things become in relation to the dollar. In other words, prices will keep going up as your purchasing power goes down. It's a sneaky way of taxing your savings without the government having to take the money from you directly. As you can see, when money is sound, that is, backed by something of intrinsic value like gold, prices remained stable for hundreds of years. People were able to save and hand that money, that store of value, down to the next generation. But in 1971, that all changed, and prices began to take off. Take Campbell's soup for example. Prices remained relatively stable for decades, but then 1971 rolls around, and the price begins to explode. What's worse is inflation tax doesn't just show up in the price. You can also have something called shrinkflation, where the price remains the same, but the product is reduced in size. Whether it's electricity, food or fruit, the case remains the same. Since 1971, prices have begun to rise. But it's not just consumer items that are affected by inflation tax, it's everything in the economy. Since 1971, productivity has increased by nearly 250%, but compensation has remained flat. Productivity has increased, but compensation has moved sideways. This can also be seen in the cost of education. While the average earnings for those between 22 to 27 years old have barely moved, the cost to attend higher education has skyrocketed. Most young adults today now have to saddle themselves with massive debts just to be able to afford to go to college. And then when they graduate, they face another huge problem: the cost of housing. Since 1971, the value of homes has gone parabolic, far exceeding income growth during the same period. In the 1950s, 60s and 70s, it would take on average 2.5 years of your labour in order to save up and purchase a house. By 2020, that figure has risen to 7 years. House prices have risen so much, you now need to work nearly 3 times longer just in order to buy the same house. The American dream, the old tale of each according to their own ability, where an average family could accumulate a modest fortune and own a small plot of land with a house and a little white picket fence, was now out of reach for most Americans. The American dream was slowly turning into the American nightmare, where even the most basic of goods and services were becoming unaffordable for the average citizen. So, what did they do? They turned to debt. Easy credit that would allow them to live the same life as their parents. While everything got more expensive, Americans would borrow and borrow, while accumulating the most debt of any generation in history. Inflation hurt everyone, but it hurt one group in particular the hardest: the poor. The wealthy know the game that is being played, and that's why they protect themselves against inflation by owning assets, such as gold, real estate, stocks, Bitcoin, and rare art. When the government prints more money, these assets on average over time increase in value, but for the poor, who hold most of their wealth in cash, the value of their money is totally destroyed, and they are crushed by the rising cost of living.
Inflation is the most destructive disease known to modern societies. There is nothing which will destroy a society so thoroughly and so fully as letting inflation run riot. Inflation doesn't arise because you got consumers who are spendthrift. They've always been spendthrift. It doesn't arise because you've got businessmen who are greedy. They've always been greedy. Inflation arises because we as citizens have been asking you as politicians to perform an impossible task. We've been asking you to spend somebody else's money on us, but not to spend our money on anybody else. Everybody talks against inflation, but what he means is that he wants the prices of the things he sells to go up and the prices of the things he buys to go down. The real tax on the American people is not what you label taxes. It's total spending. If Congress spends $50 billion more than it takes in, if government spends $50 billion, who do you suppose pays that $50 billion?
Of course.
The Arab sheiks aren't paying it. Santa Claus isn't paying it. The Tooth Fairy isn't paying it. You and I, as taxpayers, are paying it indirectly through hidden taxation.
But it's not just the United States and the dollar that are experiencing inflation. Whether you hold the Nigerian naira, the Argentine peso, or the Turkish lira, governments around the world are stealing the wealth of their populations as inflation erodes away their currency's purchasing power. So, what's going to happen from here? Well, it's going to get a lot worse everywhere. Governments and politicians in the US and around the world are not interested in the long-term trajectory of their nations. Instead, they are solely focused on the election cycle, what they can promise now, and what will garner them the most votes. They are interested in power, and if they have to spend vast sums of money on different programs in order to bribe the public to vote for them, that's what they're going to do. And why wouldn't they? They no longer have to raise taxes from the population in order to fund these projects. They simply print the money, hold on to power for as long as they can, and the population is none the wiser as to why everything around them is crumbling. Unfortunately, the debt in most nations is already too large to be paid back, so more money will need to be issued in order to pay it off. In other words, the debt is already so high, the only way forward is for nations to print more money, and in doing so, inflate their way out until their currencies are worthless. The debt to GDP ratio in the United States is already over 100%. That's double the size of the economy, and higher than during World War II. By 2050, that ratio is expected to exceed 200% of GDP, totaling more than $100 trillion of debt. By the end of the century, in the year 2100, just 73 years from now, if politicians carry on down the same path of money printing they are currently on, the national debt will exceed $1 quadrillion. Whether it be 10, 50, or 100 years from now, sooner or later the chickens are coming home to roost. As Machiavelli has said, if you're determined to have people think of you as generous, you'll have to be lavish in every possible way. Naturally, a ruler who follows this policy will soon use up all his wealth, to the point that, if he wants to keep up his reputation, he'll have to impose special taxes and do everything a ruler can to raise cash. His people will start to hate him, and no one will respect him now he has no money. Since his generosity will have damaged the majority and benefited only a few, he'll be vulnerable to the first bad news, and the first real danger may well topple him. When he realizes this and tries to change his ways, he'll immediately be accused of frugality,